Take an ear of spelt and rub it hard between your palms. Nothing usable comes out. Every kernel stays sealed inside a husk that never lets go, and no ordinary threshing will free it. That is not a defect. For roughly 2,300 years, that husk is the reason half of southern Germany planted this grain instead of the higher-yielding wheat standing in the next field. It cost them a quarter of every harvest in dead weight. It cost them a second mill in every village, an entire extra industry that existed to do nothing but strip that armour off. They paid it every year for 100 generations. Then, in about 70 years, they stopped. You can still watch one of those old hulling mills turn in Swabia today. Tonight we find out what that husk was actually doing, why a whole region built an industry around removing it, and what changed so fast that the industry died with it. Start with the plant, because spelt is not some exotic ancient species from another world. It is a true wheat, a close cousin of the loaf on your counter, with one stubborn difference. Take a modern wheat ear and rub it the same way, and the naked grains fall out clean, ready for the mill. Spelt refuses to undress. The armour is called the hull, or the gloom, and it grips the kernel so hard that the mild threshing that strips a wheat field does nothing at all. That difference sounds trivial. It is the most expensive design decision in the history of European farming. Spelt appears in the fields of Central Europe deep in the Bronze Age, and archaeologists still argue about exactly how it got there, whether it walked in from the Near East with early farmers or arose in Europe as a natural cross in somebody's mixed field. What is not argued is the takeover that followed. By around 500 years before Christ, spelt had become a principal bread grain across a broad band of the continent, through what is now southern Germany, Switzerland, and up toward the North Sea. Roman writers knew it. The granaries of the Alpine provinces filled with it. When the empire fell, spelt did not so much as flinch. The invasions, plagues, and collapses that redrew every map of the early Middle Ages rolled straight over the spelt belt and changed nothing about what came up in spring. Medieval monasteries brewed with it, baked with it, and collected their tithes in it. In Swabia, rents, debts, and dowries were reckoned in sacks of dinkel, the German name it still carries. A town in Franconia, Dinkelsbühl, likely carries the grain right in its name. Run the arithmetic from those Iron Age fields to the last great spelt harvests around 1900, and you get roughly 2,300 years of continuous service. Rome rose and fell inside spelt's shift, and you could see the grain's grip on the region in its physical infrastructure. A village in Dinkel country effectively needed 2 mills, or 1 mill doing 2 jobs. Before spelt could become flour, it had to make a separate pass through a hulling mill, a Speldsmühle, where rubbing stones crack the armour off each kernel without crushing the grain inside. That is a whole second industry. Extra buildings, extra stones, extra wages, extra waiting, bolted permanently onto the region's daily bread, in a world where bread was most of what anyone ate. Sit with how strange that is. Millers charge for every pass. Farmers count every sack. Nobody in a subsistence economy builds a redundant industry out of sentiment, and nobody maintains one for 600 years by accident. Somebody was getting something enormous for all that trouble. Everything else in this story is the answer to one question. What was worth a second mill? A run like that needs explaining, because spelt was never the obvious choice. Bread wheat, the naked kind, existed alongside it that whole time. Naked wheat yields more flour per acre. Naked wheat threshes clean in an afternoon. Any farmer could see both facts perfectly well. And for 20 centuries, across some of the best-run farmland in Europe, millions of them looked at the higher-yielding, easier grain and planted spelt anyway. Were they fools? That is the first suspect to interrogate, and the answer matters because the same choice sat in front of every generation for 2,000 years. Start with the obvious suspects for Spelt's murder and watch them fall apart one by one. Was it taste? No. Spelt bread was prized, not tolerated. It bakes into a loaf with a deep nutty flavour that modern bakers rediscovered with something close to embarrassment, and Hildegard's endorsement made it practically a sacrament in the regions that grew it. Pilgrims bought her spelt remedies, monastic kitchens cooked her spelt gruels for the sick, and the association between the grain and good health outlived her by 8 centuries. You do not abandon a food like that over flavour. Was it nutrition then? Also no. Put spelt and modern wheat side by side in a lab today, and the differences are real but modest. A little more protein here, a different mineral profile there, nothing that decides the fate of a continent's fields. And one myth needs killing on the spot, because this channel does not sell fairy tales. Spelt contains gluten, plenty of it. It is not safe for anyone with celiac disease, and most of the miraculous digestive claims made for it on modern packaging are marketing, not medicine. Whatever pushed Spelt off the continent's table, it was not the menu. Was it the yield gap then? Closer. But the yield gap had existed for the entire 2,000 years, and Spelt survived anyway, generation after generation, next to a higher yielding rival. A permanent disadvantage cannot explain a sudden death. Something else changed, and to see it, you have to stop thinking like a modern consumer and start thinking like a farmer with no safety net. Because that farmer lived in a world where the harvest regularly lost. Chronicles from the period read like weather casualty reports. Rain that rotted the sheaves where they stood, late frosts, hail, and every few decades a year bad enough to earn its own grim name in the parish records. If his crop failed, there was no imported flour coming, because bulk grain did not move far on mud roads and ox carts. There was no relief agency and no policy to claim against, only what sat in his granary and his neighbour's goodwill. A ruined harvest did not mean a lean winter. It meant selling the cow, then the land, then watching the children go hungry on somebody else's farm. Run that through a farmer's head every autumn for 100 generations, and you understand the question he was actually asking his fields. Never how much can you give me? Always how badly can you fail me? Now look at the husk again, through those eyes, because it is not doing one job. It is doing 4, and they stack. The first layer is weather. Rain in the last weeks before harvest makes naked wheat sprout in the ear, ruining a crop while it still stands in the field. Spelt's sealed hull sheds that weather and holds the kernel dry inside. Hail that shatters an open wheat ear leaves far more of a spelt ear on the stalk. But surviving the field was only the first layer, because most of a harvest is lost after it comes in. That is the second. In the granary, weevils and damp go through naked grain freely. Spelt sits in its armour season after season, which matters twice over in a region with almost no salt and precious little fuel to spare on drying. The third layer is the one that separates spelt from every other hedge a farmer had. The grain stays alive in there. Sealed in its hull, it holds its germination power for years, so a family was not only banking next winter's food, it was banking seed. A farm that lost everything could plant from a hull that had been sitting in the loft since before the disaster. And the fourth layer is where it grows at all. Spelt tolerates cold, wet, thin ground that naked wheat sulks in, climbs higher up the valleys than its rivals, and does it without a drop of fertiliser on exactly the marginal upland where these villages happened to be. So the complete calculation looked like this. The hull carried the crop through the weather, then through the granary, then kept the seed alive for the year after that, on ground that would barely carry the alternative at all. 4 protections, 1 cost, paid annually. And it turns out that stack is the answer to the second mill, because no single one of those four was ever worth building an industry for. Weather protection alone is a good year's luck. Storage alone is a better barn. It was the four together, loaded onto one plant, that made the arithmetic work. A village buying that package was not buying a crop. It was buying the right to survive its own worst year, and it put up a building to keep buying it. In a good year, the naked wheat farmer beat the spelt farmer. In a bad year, the spelt farmer ate. The proof is in the strangest food this grain ever produced. In the Bauland, a stretch of hard-luck farmland in southwest Germany, a threatened harvest left farmers one brutal choice: watch the crop die in the field or cut it green. They cut it green, unripe, and dried the young spelt over smouldering beechwood to stop it rotting. The result, called Gruenkern, the green kernel, was a famine ration that happened to taste extraordinary, smoky and rich, and it became a delicacy that outlived the emergencies that invented it. Today, Franconian Gruenkern carries a protected designation of origin from the European Union, the same legal armour as champagne. The crash landing became a luxury. There is a quieter kind of evidence too. When Swabian communities counted wealth, they counted spelt. Tithes in spelt, rents in spelt, town granaries stocked against the next failure. You do not store your emergencies in a currency that spoils. The husk made spelt the region's most trustworthy store of value, a savings account that grew on a stalk. Even the waste earned its keep, with the long straw going to thatch and the stripped hulls into pillows, a use that has quietly survived into the organic shops of today. Almost nothing about that old trust has actually expired. The grain survived, the mills survived, and the bakers who know what to do with it are easier to find every year. If you want to bake this history instead of just watching it, that is what the Medieval Bakery Collection is for. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own, the way these bakers did. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. It is all over at the Medieval Way store. Enter the roller mill. In the second half of the 19th century, 3 blows landed on spelt in quick succession, and none of them was aimed at it. The first came from the chemists. Mineral fertilizer arrived, and naked bread wheat responded to it like a racehorse, doubling and eventually tripling its yields. Spelt barely benefited. Push it with fertilizer, and its tall straw grows lush, tops over in the wind, and flattens whole fields. The one contest spelt had always lost, the good year contest, suddenly counted double, and the margin was exploding. The second blow came from the railways and the steamships. From the 1870s, grain from the American plains and the Black Sea poured into Europe at prices no local farmer could match. And cheap imports did something more profound than undercut anybody. They ended the world where a local crop failure meant local hunger. If the harvest drowned, the town bought foreign flour and nobody starved. Spelt's core product for 2,000 years had never really been flour. It had been certainty. The steamship sold certainty cheaper. The third blow was the mill itself. Industrial roller mills and city bakeries wanted one thing: endless, identical naked wheat delivered clean by the trainload. Spelt showed up wearing armour that had to be stripped at extra cost before the first grind. The fee that had bought survival for 100 generations was now a surcharge with no product attached. Breeders poured a century of work into bred wheat and left spelt where it stood in 1850. Sons planted what sold. Acre by acre, Dinkle country quietly stopped being Dinkle country. And you can watch the retreat in the buildings. As the fields shrank, the hulling mills lost their customers, and one by one the machinery whole valleys had been organised around fell silent, was scrapped, or was converted to something else. Each mill that closed made Spelt harder to sell in that district, which shrank the fields further, which closed the next mill. Notice what is missing from this murder. There is no villain in it. Nobody conspired against Spelt, and the grain that replaced it genuinely fed more people from less land, which mattered on a continent that had known real famine within living memory. Fertilizer took over the fourth layer. Trade took over the first three. One by one, the protections the hull provided were bought more cheaply somewhere else, and what remained of the hull was just the bill. But the bill was never only grain. It was a building. And that is what finished it, because the second mill turns out to be the whole story running backwards. For 600 years, the hulling mill was the thing that made Spelt possible. Once it closed, it became the thing that made Spelt impossible. A farmer in 1955 who still believed in the old grain, who had the seed and the ground and the will, could not sell a harvest nobody within 50 miles could dehull. His loyalty was no longer a decision. It was a logistics problem, and he lost it to a building that had already been converted. Spelt did not lose a contest with wheat. Its infrastructure was dismantled around it, and a grain you cannot mill is a grain you cannot plant. By the 1970s, Spelt survived on scattered fields in Swabia and Switzerland and a few Belgian valleys, grown mostly by farmers, too stubborn or too remote to switch. 2,300 years, ending in a rounding error, which makes the sequel genuinely strange. Spelt came back, and it came back for exactly the property that had ruled before. In the 1980s, organic farmers went looking for a bread grain that could perform without the chemical safety net they had just given up, and there it stood, the crop that had spent 2 millennia doing precisely that. Its unfashionable toughness was suddenly a specification. At the same time, a wave of interest in Hildegard of Bingen swept Germany, and her 900-year-old endorsement turned out to be the best marketing copy a grain ever had. Artisan bakers followed, chasing the nutty depth of flavour. German fields now carry Spelt on the order of 100,000 hectares, a recovery of more than 100-fold from the low point, and Dinkel bread sits in ordinary bakery windows again, priced as a premium product. The grain that was dropped for costing too much now sells for more than the wheat that replaced it. And this is where the story stops being about a German grain and starts being about your dinner. The wheat that won now supplies close to a fifth of all the calories humanity eats, much of it from a narrow band of closely related varieties bred for yield and grown across enormous unbroken areas. That is a spectacularly efficient way to feed 8 billion people. It is also the exact opposite of what a Swabian farmer would have called a safe field. He spread his risk across 4 protections loaded onto one plant and paid a permanent fee for it. Modern farming concentrated the risk and spends the savings on fertilizer, fungicide, and freight, which works beautifully until a season goes wrong in several places at once. Nobody serious wants to go back to hulling stones, but the professionals have started looking backward for parts. Plant breeders and gene banks keep old Spelt varieties alive, not out of nostalgia, but because weather tolerance, performance on poor ground, and the pest resistance of a sealed hull are exactly the traits a more volatile climate is putting back on the wish list. A century ago, the industry judged Spelt on the one metric that mattered then, tons per acre in a stable world. The world has stopped feeling quite so stable, and metrics have a way of changing back. One word of honesty, because this channel does not repeat marketing. Some claims riding the Spelt wave are false, the gluten-free myth worst of all, and others are inflated. What is real is the agronomy, the flavour, and the husk, which protects organic grain in the field exactly as it protected medieval grain in the granary. If you try it, respect its age. Spelt's gluten is more delicate and more extensible than modern wheats, so knead gently and briefly. Keep the fermentation short, and expect a slacker dough. Overwork it and the loaf spreads instead of rising. Treat it kindly and you get bread with a depth plain white flour cannot reach. This is one piece of the Middle Ages you can eat on a Tuesday. So add up what that husk actually cost and what it bought. 1 plant, 4 protections stacked on a single kernel. A quarter of every harvest surrendered as dead weight, and a second mill standing in the village to strip it off, paid for 100 generations without anyone writing down why. It was never a stupid tax on a stubborn grain. It was the price of a field that could fail without taking the family with it, and the moment the world could sell that safety more cheaply, the tax stopped making sense, and the mills went quiet within a lifetime. Some of them are turning again. A handful of hulling mills in Swabia are back at work, because the bakeries want the grain, and the grain still cannot be milled any other way. The armour never changed, only the arithmetic around it did. Subscribe for more food history the modern menu forgot. Have you baked with Spelt, loved it, or found it overhyped? Tell me below. Stay curious.